All right. All right, cool. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to my workshop on modern economics. If you don't know who I am, my name is Shannon Wardlaw. I'm one of the core adjudication for the upcoming East Asia Pre-WUDC tournament this weekend. I'm also on the CAP for the Pan-African University Debating Championships that's happening now in December, which is really exciting in Johannesburg. And I'm the current champion of the African Legends Invitational round robin that happened this year, amongst some other things. But most importantly, I think, is that my favorite types of motions are economic motions. I studied economics throughout my university career. It's something I am incredibly passionate about. So when I was told that I could talk about whatever I wanted for this workshop, and then my initial idea about like how to lightly commit treason was shot down, I thought, let me talk about what's on my mind in terms of economics and economic theory in the modern age. So I think I want to do a couple of things with this workshop. Firstly, because I want to relate it back to debating, but not make it like every other debating economics workshop you guys have probably had or can find on YouTube already. I'm going to give you some simple tools that I use in every economics motion. But then the vast majority of this workshop is actually going to be perhaps new directions for your case file, interesting things you probably haven't thought about that are shaping modern economics um, today. So I think like mainly, when we ask ourselves like, oh, there's so much to know about economics, we just kind of give up and we're just like, I just hate economic motions, instead of, just finding some things that really interest us and shaping those into our economics debates. Okay. So firstly, in terms of basics with economics, right? And also just for this workshop, just because I am quite a yapper and I'm very Zoom not confident, I would just probably ask that if anybody has questions, I'm not going to take you live. Maybe just put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to yap for a long time now. And secondly, I've had problems before with like people attempting to annotate or write on my notes. Please don't do that. And any other disturbances like putting on your mics, things like that. Okay. When it comes to economics, first thing I think of is my three basic rules about all economics motions. This has been something that everybody needs to know, right? Firstly, economics and the economy itself can be challenged and should be challenged. That's what's going to be the vast majority of this workshop as well. I think when we approach economics for the first time in our lives, we see it as something that it just is. We're just exposed to the economy. We have to abide to it. And if someone says, oh, but that's the economy or that's an economic policy, you just have to accept it. That is not true. The economy is made of the decisions of everyday people and decisions of our governments and our institutions. So if we can track those decisions and change those decisions on a very wide enough scale, we can change the economy itself. And that's what you can challenge and you can argue in debates, especially it's actually more efficient in debates because it's only in the vacuum of a 7-minute speech. The second thing is that economics cannot be devoid of its social and political consequences. Everything that happens in the economy is not some fancy mathematical equation that has no stake on our lives. It is, in fact, probably one of the things that is the most influential on our lives. And therefore, it affects our politics and our political decisions, our political thinkings, and even our own individual ideologies and our social networks, our society, our standard of livings, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive people around us. And therefore, people like that when I tell them that, because that means that you don't need to argue economic theory in economic motions. There's always something to say about some political social principle that you can at very least bring in and perhaps be a little bit more confident in. However, let's still bring in the economics. The third thing that I tell everybody for economics motions is that having additional information about how economics works, in general economic theory, can help and does help and is the reason you're probably getting an 83 or an 84. But not having that additional economic theory is not a reason to lose these debates. If you are losing economics debates and don't have a lot of economic theory, that is more of a strategic issue than it is a content issue. So when people ask me strategically, where do we need to start in economics debates? You start with the very basic premise that economics is made up of the decisions of people, governments, and institutions. And therefore, you can make it an actor debate. So, what factors are important to the economy that we should constantly be considering? And what do they care about? Three basic ones. You can obviously expand on these in any way you want in economics debates, but here's your basic starting point, right? Firms. What do firms care about? They care about making a profit. Households. What do households care about? They care about raising their standard of living, living better, earning more money, having less working hours. But because they're also made up of individuals and families, they also care about their moral and ethical concerns. Governments, what do governments care about? For some reason, this is always the most difficult for people to answer. We can talk all day about, whether or not governments care about their people and their standard of living and the economy itself. But generally, basic premise, governments care about staying in power. Usually, staying in power means making good economic decisions and good political decisions so that people continue to vote for you, but that's not always that simple. All right. And so, basic actors you can start with. Then, what I personally do is I then impose the motion onto these different actors and track what impacts that changes and then how does that fit and align in with their incentive. Actually, if you think about some very basic economic theory, which is this flow of value that we usually like look at in your first year of economics, right? Between like how do we create value or how do we move money and value between different sectors of the economy, you are doing the exact same thing. You are identifying factors and then you are identifying what decisions they are making. You go to work, you make money, that goes back to the household. The household then spends that in a market for goods and services, which then profits off of that, which then makes money for firms who can reinvest it into their factors of production, maybe hiring more people. And then I just look at like a little bit more advanced economic theory, my interjections and my leakages. Investments push more money into the economy. What sector is it being pushed into? And how does that change the next decision that's going to be made? Government spending means that we're pushing money in. The government is spending money on individuals, like, for example, through welfare checks and exports. And then leakages would be savings. I'm making money at work, but I'm not spending it in the marketplace. I'm saving it in the household because I'm worried about the future of the economy. Moves money out of it, which then affects a chain of decisions that's going to be happening. Same with taxes, same with imports, etc. All right. So that's where I usually start as my baseline point of economics and how to approach economic debates. Additionally, I find it helpful to know a little bit about supply and demand. Ryan Lafferty already has a fantastic economic workshop on YouTube that you can find where he goes into detail about supply and demand. Having a little bit of knowledge about markets and market failures is definitely really helpful, especially in debates where you're making sweeping allegations that capitalism is bad. Being able to back that up with why it is a market failure and it's a market failure that can be specifically fixed by this motion, always helpful information to have, in my opinion. But generally, I just find that having descriptive analysis and approaching it from a human perspective, it sharpens my economic debates. That's what I personally find. All right, but let's talk a little bit more about modern economics, because one of the things that I find to be a little bit of a failure of this classical economics approach that we've already talked about to some extent, right, is that this approach, especially when it comes to macroeconomics, is made with the assumption that there is stability in the economy or that the economy operates on a level of stability that we call the equilibrium. And then, even if an economy has some kind of shock, that is part of a natural form of ebbs and flows that the economy is then able to adjust back to using the invisible hand of supply and demand. And thus, we continue to live in an equilibrium. We just have ebbs and flows throughout the economy. Basic principles that economic theory abides to, that what I just even showed you abides to. However, there is some argument to say that this doesn't play out the way it should, and it's ought to be challenged, right? A couple of reasons it ought to be challenged is because, firstly, wait, I think I'm going to go into this more anyway. But firstly, we do not experience the ebbs and flows. We experience massive economic shocks and more frequently. Something like COVID, a huge international pandemic, used to be something that was a bit of an anomaly in terms of economic shocks. Now it is tied to a consistent pattern of epidemics and pandemics that are separate from things like financial shocks, that are separate from things like government and institutional changes that make economic shocks. So we live in a time where we have far more shocks at a far larger scale, and we are not returning back to equilibrium. And therefore, basic economic theory is starting to not play out the way that it says it should, all right? However, what we're doing with modern economics, right? What people are continuing to do is we're still exploring how societies allocate our scarce resources in this rapidly changing world. That is still the basic premise of economics. If you ask what economics is, it is a question of scarcity. It is the question that there is only a finite amount of resources on this planet, and I can talk about that for hours and hours on end. And there is an increasingly growing population with an increasingly larger amount of wants and desires. All right. And so, because of that, then we need to consider how to allocate that finite amount of resources in a way that makes sense to meet the demands and desires of these increasing population. That is the question of scarcity that economics tries to solve, right? But secondly, modern economics also questions how to integrate technology, policy, and global trends into these traditional economic models, and it focuses on the complex understandings of interactions that humans have between markets and the behavior that we can track through specifically the process of data collection. What shapes and defines what modern economics is today? I would say, obviously, the most important thing to shape and define modern economics today is the age of globalization that we have experienced in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, right? Because this was a contemporary period that was characterized by a dramatic increase in interconnectedness between the worlds and interdependence amongst nations that was driven largely by advancements in technology, communication, and transportation, essentially through loosening trade agreements, more interconnected travel, and the use of the internet. We, as a global society, have been able to exchange goods and services in ways that were unprecedented in classical economic theory, all right? And that fundamentally reshaped global economics by creating an integrated world economy where production, trade, and finance operates across national borders. Note, what's important there is that it's singular in its approach. This is one single global economy, a single global economy, as opposed to like individual national economies that can then be tracked individually without having to have consideration of the effects of other economies that they can have on them and how their economic policy can affect other economies. That doesn't happen anymore. We do need to think of it at a global scale, which is more difficult to do. That reshapes both opportunities and risks for our economies, but it also highlights the importance of structuring trade agreements in ways that are favorable to the collective, questioning multinational firms or multinational corporations that are operating in more than one country, and also about interrogating and creating more transparency for the supply chain vulnerabilities that we experience that harm our economic practices, okay? Because what this does is four things, right? I think it creates interconnected supply chains that span continents and have the creation of a single global market that creates more of a demand for multinational corporations. It also creates a rise in financial institutions, which I want to talk about a lot today. It increases our trade flows, our foreign investment, and our cultural exchange. All of these are generally cool things that we often argue in debates to promise that globalization should stand at the end of this motion, and probably it should. And it generates debates about inequality, offshoring, labor, and national competitiveness. Okay, so all of that is with regards to globalization. What then is the future of economics, right? There's a couple of things that we probably should consider. Artificial intelligence and automation, that's going to transform labor markets and productivity. How our demographics are going to change, and that's going to impact our pensions, our healthcare, our workforce sizes. And that means that our government policies are going to have to be differently structured in order to meet the demands of those people who have an increasingly smaller labor pool, an increasingly higher cost of living, and increasingly are disconnected from, the policies that affect their lives, like pensions. This is where perhaps a more thorough conversation about universal basic income should be kept up in 2025 rather than sidelined just because no particular government seems to support it. And then, thirdly, the decentralization of our finances and the increasing involvement of digital currencies that can reshape our financial institutions depending on how we use them and frame them. All right. All of this challenges the basic assumptions that we were talking about earlier, right? Okay, so we've already talked about this actually. The first main assumption that's consistently being challenged is that the economy returns to equilibrium. That's not what happens. I've already spoken a little bit about this, okay? And the 2008 financial crisis uniquely challenged this perspective on a global scale. And then the second challenge is that people are well-informed, rational, and dedicate their attention and efforts towards one particular goal, which is creating value for the economy, all right? That's the assumptions being challenged. Okay. Now, are we rational decision makers? Is it a debate in and of itself? But the increasing amount of people who are buying labubus and spending their life savings on gamblings makes it challenging debates to say the least. All right. But what if we have this baseline assumption, we can then make models that are clean, logical, and predictable. With people being unpredictable, it makes our economic models and the increasing use of them unpredictable. And the whole reason we have economists is actually to predict what is going to happen from our economic behavior so that we can create policies that are going to benefit from those predictions and not detract from those predictions, from what's going to happen, right? And so this assumption that we're all rational especially makes more sense in simple barter economies when we're just exchanging goods and services with one another, but not in the hyper consumerism and financialized economy that is on a global scale that we have to or that we have to exist in today. All right. All of this is further explored in a competitive school of thought to classical economics called behavioral economics. All right. So I always said in the beginning that economics can and should be challenged. People are doing that by studying different schools of thoughts of economics and devising different ways we should think about our underlying principles of economics. I'm going to be showing you maybe a few of these. I can't remember how many I put into this presentation, but behavioral economics is one that you can also go and explore, right? This is where we use psychology and data to inherently examine the biases that influence our real world decisions. And it emphasizes that understanding human behavior improves predictions and it makes our policies more effective. This also challenges the assumption that individuals always act rationally. And this can be applied then to policy design, marketing, and financial behavior. So now that we a little bit better understand where our modern economy came from, what shaped it, and what assumptions are being challenged in the modern economy, what does this all create for me, at very least, right? I think there's a couple of things to consider. We've created what we consider to be like an age of financialization. This describes that we have become an economy based on our financial motives, markets, and actors. They have a much larger role than the economy. Think of the use of currency, how broadly it's used. In fact, currency isn't just exchange for goods and services anymore. We have the exchange of currency itself that is a value-based system that increases the value of currencies without having to provide any use to our standard of living by literally being used to decide like the price of bread, for example. We invest in stocks and bonds. We make online investments, etc. PDOs from the 2008 financial crisis means that people were placing bets on each other's investments, and that was a way to raise their own value as well. And all of this means that we live in an age where unlike traditional barter system where it's like I give you money and you give me good and service in exchange, we are trading value for increased value. And the more that we come together and add that together, the more value it then accumulates. Okay. So this tells us what modern economics looks like and what should be challenged about it. I think this was exemplified to some extent or amplified by also the rise of Keynesianism, or it aligns with the rise of Keynesianism. Keynesianism, I should say, sorry. Because as wealth and value becomes something that is increasingly exchanged through financial institutions. It becomes more difficult for people in poverty to be able to access that increased value in the economy. The economy's value might go up without people's livelihood and standard of living going up, all right? And so this was predicted to some extent by John Maynard Keynes, who published the general theory of employment, interest, and money, arguing that demand, not supply, determines employment, and the government must intervene rather to alleviate unemployment. Okay, so in simple terms, the school of thought argues that the government should actively manage the economy to smooth out these booms and busts. When it's doing good, the government should take a step back. When it's doing bad, the government, as a last resort, should be able to come in and inject money into the economy by spending it on public works, like welfareism, being able to give people welfare checks, child support checks, elderly checks, disability checks, etc., and literal positive infrastructure, being able to create schools that people can go to for free, hospitals that people can access for free or for cheap, be public infrastructure that you wouldn't be able to otherwise access or pay for yourself, all right? Public transportation, roads, networks, police services, etc., things like that. And secondly, by cutting taxes to leave more money in people's pockets, because then the basic theory that people will then have more purchasing power, spend that purchasing power, hopefully not save that money because they're worried about the economy. And then because you're spending that money, it's going to then create value because of the exchange, means that you are following what we call aggregate demand, right? Which is more explored coming up now as well, okay? Because of this financialization of the economy, like money then is the value-based commodity itself instead of simply being an administrative means of exchange. It's explored by Milton Friedman, right? And I have a funny story. Like I once, in a debate was making this argument, something along the lines of this argument. I don't remember the exact debate itself, to my speaking partner. And they said, we should never start an argument with Friedman said. And I was like, pretty sure his grandson is running an island that is challenging the way global economics should look like. So I'm happy to support some basics of his theories. But anyways, so in the system of financialization, right, the financial sector's focus can shift from fueling real economic production, like building factories, etc., towards rather gearing our profits through purely financial activities like complex derivative tradings that do not then translate to necessarily people having more food on the table, okay? And it also can mean, even if we're not having financialization being solely value-based exchange, in the sense that like it has no translation to what we can actually touch. Like think about the rise of cryptocurrencies, for example. But it can also just mean that we're moving away from industrial economies to just service-based economies as our main mode of economic production, because then what people can access is not resources, but at least very much themselves. And so themselves and their labor becomes their main source of being able to get an income when industries and industrial practices do not exist to provide them labor to work in, all right? And this can decouple financial markets performance from the health of the underlying economy, all right? So again, going back to then, if that's happening and it's creating a huge wealth gap, then there's a call for governments to step in and say, okay, but for the people who then are not being able to access jobs, who are not being able to access financial resources or financial sectors, what can we do? And the problem is that not everybody supports welfare economics and welfareism. To be fair, there is a lot of problems that can arise in a completely welfare system, especially a lot of it comes down to mismanagement of funds from government sectors and being able to organize in a way that increases the like level of value that you see from that, so that you keep your votes, so that people stay happy and don't feel like their money or taxpayers' money or economic value is being wasted on these welfare like systems. Okay, and so that's why there's been a huge counter movement of something we call austerity. Austerity is when you start to limit government spending. One particularly weird assumption in debating is that we limit austerity, I mean, we limit the government spending and austerity solely to pay off debt to like the IMF and our financial institutions loans or international financial institutions loans. It doesn't necessarily have to be for that, but the main thing is that you cut back welfare, you cut back government spending, but you do not cut back taxes. You actually increase taxes or you keep taxes the same. So the government has more money, but it's not going back towards the people on the ground in a way that is just more organized. It goes towards investments or financial structures, or it could be debt repayments. Anyways, so so we have this creation of an age of financialization, right? That means that then our focus of the way that we structure economics is based on investments, okay? A lot of this, as I talked about, was Friedman's like aggregate demand model, right? Okay, which is the total demand of goods and services in the economy at a given time and price level, and it's defined by the formula that you've probably seen in your economics books already, okay? The problem is the most volatile of this formula is investment, and it's propped up by the financialization, meaning we push investment without immediate benefit. So when firms are optimistic and invest heavily, then aggregate demand means that like the value of that skyrockets because people are investing in it, not because it's fulfilled any kind of like benefit towards our economy, all right? That pulls the economy up in terms of GDP, in terms of the mechanisms that we use to track the economy right now. And therefore, that makes us more optimistic, which means that more money is invested because there's now a demand for that investment. There's now a demand for international investment because this economy is doing so well and this money is getting invested and invested and invested. And it pulls up prices and values artificially because we assume people have more money to spend from a growing and booming economy, but it doesn't actually align with upticks with on the ground standards of living actually improving. This then creates the basis of inflation that erodes people's purchasing power, people's ability to spend their money on as much as they possibly can get value out of it that directly affects their household and their standard of living. Okay, this is all represented in the way macroeconomic policy structures are shown today as well. Central banks now need to balance inflation and control this with employment goals on a much larger scale than they have ever before. Okay, fiscal policy now, well, not now, but increasingly influences growth through spending and taxation. And we have post-pandemic economies that are facing higher and higher debt, higher inflation pressures, and that means that we're shifting our interest rates in order to accommodate for that like debt and inflation. Okay, and this explains the challenges that policymakers face when stabilizing our modern economies. In tandem with this is the digital economy and the rise of the digital economy that really shows what we're dealing with today, right? We've got automation and artificial intelligence that may be improving productivity for stakeholders who are deriving value, but it's reshaping jobs and skills and widening wealth gaps, okay? Digital platforms are dominating key markets and influence consumer behavior. And that means that a rise of data is being used in order to track how people are spending things, but also to influence people's ability to spend whatever purchasing power we have left. And of course, financial tech innovations are disrupting banking payments and financial systems in ways that are unprecedented. And so, therefore, we don't have the same kind of regulation that we would, especially when it's on a global scale and not a national scale. All of this then shows that the rise of this digital first business and digital first economy that is premised on data collection to be able to, maximize aggregate demand towards certain industries that people can then profit from is a core economic asset in our modern economies. So I think quickly there, right, a couple of things. In terms of investment, we can see this happening on a global, an individual, and a national scale. Globally, we see investment being played out through things like financial institutions, which I'm going to talk about more now. Nationally, we see it being played out by the way we create or allow for, at very least, economic policies that challenge ownership. I'm going to talk about that as well. And individually, individuals are also finding their own ways to operate in the digital economy, right? This is why we have an increase in the sharing economy, people investing into Bitcoin and digital currency, commodities. All of this is us making our own individual forms of investment. So all of these aspects of our economy are premised a lot more on investment than what we assumed our economy to be premised on in previous models of understanding the economy, all right? Let's talk about financial institutions. Again, you've probably spoken about financial institutions to some extent in other economics lectures. Three things you probably talked about is international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. You've probably talked about central banks and their control of inflation through monetary and fiscal policies. And you've maybe just talked about like things like hedge funds, for example, which I also enjoy talking about, but is not something we're going to talk about today. I think two financial institutions we don't talk about enough that are increasingly becoming more prevalent in debating, in my opinion, or at least I am making it so because I talk about these things any chance I get, is global financial marketing platforms, like business platforms like Swift. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is sovereign wealth funds, just to give you a heads up, right? So what is Swift? So Swift is a society for worldwide interbank financial telecommunications. What is this? It is a cooperative society that provides a secure and standardized messaging network for financial institutions globally. It is crucial to understand that SWIFT is not a payment system itself. It does not hold or transfer any money, but what it does is it acts as a secure messaging service that banks and other financial institutions use to send payment orders and other instructions to each other. So, if you were ever wondering, like, how do global leaders and central banks be able to communicate policies with other global leaders and central banks? Is it all through emails so that we can have things like Pizzagate that happened in the United States happen globally? Well, it's increasingly being like, no, I would say it's the main thing now that we put it through Swift. So this means that this is the cooperative central way that we are interacting with each other as a global community in terms of our business and our central bank and our government economic policy practices. Okay. That means that it's like the United Nations, but just for business practices. Think of it like that. Okay. And it doesn't just include global leaders, it also includes huge companies and stakeholders that operate on there. So it's also a way for people to create and people to start conversations and economic partnerships that they wouldn't be able to create otherwise because of maybe the limitations of globalization or just the bureaucracy of global politics and international relations. All right. Now, what's interesting then about this, right, is that again, because it's interconnected all on one platform, it holds a lot of power. It's a centralization of the way that we're conducting economic business. Power can be yielded in good or bad ways. What's I think is the most interesting use of SWIFT in the modern age is that it is one of the main ways that we are sanctioning Russia for their increasing like war against Ukraine. And so Russia has been kicked off essentially, and major business partners from Russia and key politicians have been kicked off from being able to use SWIFT and operate on SWIFT. That is a way that we are sanctioning in the modern age, right? But secondly, this also perhaps poses global threats because it is something that is inherently connected to the internet and it's so interconnected and it's so heavily dependent on and relied on. Any kind of issues that we have with Swift could then create unique challenges for the global world order in business and economics. All right, secondly, let's talk about sovereign wealth funds. This is my version of how to make your country rich from scratch. Okay, if you haven't seen those YouTube videos, please go watch them. They have millions of views each. All right. So what are sovereign wealth funds? Sovereign wealth funds are state-owned pools of money that governments invest to achieve various national objectives. They are typically funded by revenues from natural resources like oil and gas, or from trade surpluses and foreign exchange reserves. So, what's key in this characteristic is that this is money that is going into long term investments that the government owns. Okay. So, just in the way all the people on TikTok that you see scrolling past are telling you guys, like, oh, you need to invest your money in your 20s so that it's a lot more money when you're in your 50s. That's what the government is doing. So they have money that they are then putting into investment pools, investment bonds, stocks, etc. And then they are deriving dividends from that. Okay. But it's usually also focused on a diversified assets of wealth preservation and a general preference for taking minority stakes in companies rather than seeking control. All right. So so if I had to put this in layman's terms, right? If I was given a developing country, I do come from a developing country, South Africa, right? And I was told, okay, you have to take a developing country and create a really great economy out of it, right? So I could have the approach where it's like, okay, if I have access to what probably makes me unique as a developing country, which is a huge amount of natural resources at my disposal, diamonds, oil, gas, coal, things like that, right? Then I could trade that to other countries, get paid for that, and I could spend that money on welfare systems for my people or investments in infrastructure, education, etc. Or instead of immediately spending that money, I could put it into a sovereign wealth fund. I could then have that sovereign wealth fund be managed by several hedge funds globally, where I don't have to then take on a large amount of roles in the decision-making powers of those like of that money. And what the hedge fund's probably going to do with it is they're going to probably go and buy property in California, for example, and they're going to then profit off of that property. And then from that profit, it's going to go back to then me as a government, which I'm then going to spend the dividends. I'm then going to spend the profits on my people, but I don't then lose the principal amounts and any additional interjection that I've had from that dividends. And that means that that wealth can continue to grow. And my people can also get whatever injection I had from that initial trade of resources. Okay. That's what that would look like in layman's terms. All right. So, I mean, that's obviously a very like basic understanding or basic way to explain it. It would be more complicated, right? And you can explain it in a more complicated way and with additional information. But that's just so we all are on the same page, right? All right. So if we think about it like that, right? So let's link this back to an age of globalization. A lot of developing countries are facing dependency theory, right? Where we're being stripped of our natural resources and we are being used for labor of our youth. We're being used for like ownership of our land, and business sectors being bought out by multinational corporations because there's only so many finite businesses you can fit into one space. You can only have so many McDonald's on one street, for example. All of that is being stripped, it's being sold and taken by overseas companies, right? And perhaps that means a little bit of a rise in the standard of living because people get jobs, people get a little bit of money on the ground, people get a McDonald's on their streets. But generally, we're not profiting then off of all the opportunity that exists within our own countries, all right? So, in the age of globalization, like being able to understand the financial market and use it in ways that would be able to increase your wealth rather than simple trade exchanges becomes more and more important in order for you to create actually useful economic policies, right? So, I mean, we've all been in debates where people are just arguing like we need to trade more. That's how we would be able to increase money. And then people are like, we've all heard other people say like Western nations are stripping us of resources, and that's it. That's where those arguments end. There isn't this additional discussion about like, okay, so what do emerging economies that are moving from agricultural or resource-based economies towards industrial economies specifically need? If they need capital influxes, then is the answer that we need to get more loans that create even more dependency theory? Or is it that we need to restructure the way we think about the value that we currently hold in order to be able to increase benefits for our country and our individuals on the ground? This can also be an approach to Dutch disease in developing countries, right? Especially if you're very heavily resource based as a country. The Dutch disease can be prevalent. This is the economic phenomenon where a large influx of revenue from a natural resource causes the national currency to appreciate, which in turn makes other exports more expensive and the manufacturing and agricultural sectors less competitive. All right. The solution to this is economic diversification, but it's difficult to do that if those industries don't previously exist. And it's difficult to then prop up those industries if you are heavily reliant on one industry. Obviously, diversification is generally good in any economics debates. I do argue it in most motions, right? So if you want to use something like a sovereign wealth fund or a similar approach, you don't have to use these words to win the debate, but you just need to describe this level of thinking further than just, we just need more money, we just need more trade, etc., things like that. Um, but sovereign wealth funds can be a solution to that because if you are heavily invested in one sector, and being able to take that money from that sector and being able to diversify it without losing that money can be helpful to your government, okay? And it creates more investments, all right? So that does seem simple enough, but it's still dependent on two things. Firstly, how good your investments are. If you're losing all of that money, then the problem is you're not actually making a very successful sovereign wealth fund. Secondly, also, how much money do you have in that sovereign wealth fund? If you go and look at examples of sovereign wealth funds, like the Pule Fund from Botswana, which is a very good one, there's a national one in Norway that's a very famous one. They are billions of dollars that are invested in this, but that can still be a very small part of what their actual economy is worth in terms of their resources and what is actually needed to transform their economy for their people. All right. So so there's a couple of things then, right? Why are sovereign wealth funds perhaps being used at such a minuscule scale in terms of like the actual value that economy can bring into those sovereign wealth funds to be able to profit and invest from that initial value, right? It could be because government mismanagement, but it could also just be a question of government ownership. For a government to push the profits of that sector into a financial product like a fund, the government needs to own that sector, right? And in a lot of countries, like in my country in South Africa, the problem is that perhaps like we had like concessions during the like stop of apartheid, the African National Congress, the ANC under Nelson Mandela, made concessions where a lot of these industries were made available, and so, essentially like that ownership or that space in the economy was sold to private entities, which diminished government involvement in the economy, government ownership over economic sectors that we could have profited from and been able to then reinvest in the economy. All right, but even then. Beyond just the question of like how much of your economy is already privatized, do your people trust your governments? Because essentially, what you do want is that money to not just be invested initially to create dividends, but for that dividends to then go back into your economy and towards your people. So essentially, what you're actually arguing for is not for governments to have control, but for people to have more purchasing power. And sovereign wealth funds uniquely give government's ownership, not necessarily control of those funds and how those funds are going to be seen then over time. Okay. Why does this all matter, right? This is where we should probably discuss that major drivers of inequality and possible policy responses. So income and wealth gaps have widened in many advanced economies, especially in the last 3 decades, and especially because of the technological changes that disproportionately benefit high skilled workers. And just like we said before, as we increasingly become a more financialized economy, people just from the basis of not maybe understanding that economy as much or not having access to it because you need basic registration, initial capital to invest, documentation in order to be able to like access things like private banks or financial products means that it becomes more and more divided in terms of our wealth rights. So we can have progressive policies. We can have a look at our taxation policies and our labor protections, right? We can also create more welfare and social programs like we talked about before to try and reduce disparities. But this is all on the basis of a significant question of ownership. How much of our economy does our government and our people actually have ownership and a say in order to create policies that actually affect our economy? Or else, if it's just continuously privately owned, it's just going to become wider and wider and wider, right? So another school of thought I want to bring in is cooperative and communal economics. This is what I studied in university under development theory. And it's just really interesting. I was really looking for this video about this project that was a experiment where people in a country, I think it was Sweden or something like that, and it was just a group of 50 people that were acting as a commune or a cooperative. They bought a building together, and then in that building, they became a self-sustaining economy of 50 people only. So two people were taking on like outside jobs. They were working from home on laptops to create a small amount of income that was mainly getting invested into council taxes and internet payments. Everything else, food, you know, was being like built on the land and in the space that they had. You know, they were taking care of one another by learning medical skills and being able to sew their own clothes, etc. And they were trying to increasingly remove themselves from the economy. And what they said is that when there's only 50 of them, they can deeply understand the needs of every single one of their people, and they can plan extensively to take the resources that they have to make sure that they maximize that being allocated in a way that deals with the unique issues of every single one of those people. So they were saying that in smaller cooperatives where they have complete ownership of their resources and they obviously have benevolent allocation of those resources, they're able to create a far more efficient economic approach, all right? And that's the basis of what cooperative economics is, right? It's a theory of involving cooperation, working together for common goals into society. In practice, then, individuals would organize into cooperatives or co-ops, which are consenting groups of individuals who meet their social and economic needs together. And it takes on a more socialist approach in microeconomics, and it is against individualism in economic theory, right? Think of grocery stores that are owned by members who decide then what are the general practices and what are the investments going to look like? Are we expanding the store? Are we opening up another location? If think about everybody owning a 0.01% stock, everyone in the community owning a 0.01% stock in their local grocery store. And therefore, when major decisions like that come up, they would send out an email where you could vote in on those major decisions because you are an acting member, all right? And if another way like that could operate is with credit unions. So in the way now that happens is that stocks, we can invest in stocks, but that's on an individualistic basis. And there are, you know, hedge funds, financial institutions that profit off of the management of our financial products for us. Banks also operate on this system. But what if we had credit unions where I am investing money and there's maybe a rule that it can be a very low level amount of investment? Then I don't just make an investment. I'm not a client. I then become a member and I decide with everyone else who also invested money how that money is going to be spent in order to make a profit that is then going to be divided amongst us. All right. So what's unique there is the membership part of it, right? That's a revolutionary approach to what ownership should look like, okay? And this theory of cooperative economics was discussed by W.E.B. Du Bois with the flight of African Americans in the creation of mutual aid societies, right? Like the Black Panthers. He argued that African Americans could not achieve the American dream through capitalist gain because of the segregation and racism that they experienced. Thus, the ability to voluntarily form an economy based on cooperation was built on the foundation of solidarity and to politically separate from the white economy and stabilize their own communities. This meant if they wanted to join the mainstream economy, they could do so from a position of strength. And cooperative economics thus became a way for marginalized groups in society to survive when capitalism fails them. All right. So what is then unique then about these cooperative and communal economic theory, right? It's that there's mutual investment into the values and the organization of labor, and mainly through the pooling together of available resources and the contributions to the structure of the microeconomy. Secondly, there's equal ownership in land and resources amongst all members of the cooperative. So the cooperative would have complete ownership of the land, the resources. They're thus able to govern their own economy externally for the broader economy of the nation as much as possible. And to modern cooperatives, this may also include environmentally friendly practices as well as measures to take the cooperative off grid. And also the mutual benefit from profit or surplus. Some cooperatives also argue economies ought not make a profit, or at least strive to do so, and others say that the operations must be in cash in order to remove the concept of credits. So there's a couple of questions then we can still have of cooperative and communal economics, right? Now, the organization of society can be very difficult because we do still have individual needs and desires, right? It's difficult to manage people in and of itself. So, what do hierarchical structures still look like? That's why, when you just have communes that don't necessarily have to practice communal economics, but just come together for mutual aid living, they can often divulge into cults because they might be led by incredibly charismatic and influential personalities that do not have the best interests of the people at heart, but are able to convince them to give up any individualistic society for the collective, not the greater good, but just that individual collective. And that's why people, sometimes assume that this is just always a cult, but it doesn't need to be a cult on the basic principles of the economy. So again, this could still be formalized through institutions, again, like cooperative markets that are already being able, or not being able to. I'm just saying that there's no laws against them, but we're seeing a rise of in America and in the UK with like Co-op, for example, as a supermarket. Okay. And that is a formal and institutionalized way to channel that in a way that at least has accountability structures so that, people are then protected and there can still be laws and regulations in the way that cooperatives are able to be maintained within society. But mainly, I think it's also just about like still a lot of administration questions, what happens, for example, when people make bad decisions? Do we absorb the risk or are we supposed to be protected against the risk in cooperatives? I think is the main question I would probably argue if someone was so clever to argue cooperative economics in a debate against me. All right. Another very important issue in the modern age is environmental economics. I know I'm going a bit over time, guys, but just bear with me. Because in our environmental economics and the environmental economic schools of thoughts that shape our understanding of how the economy and the environment, and therefore environmental degradation and economic degradation, are highly linked to one another. Okay. The impacts of climate change means that our economy is harmed, all right? And so using tools like carbon taxes and cap and trade systems to reduce emissions can also stabilize our economy, or at least stop us from having to put in mass amounts of investment later down the line in our economy to reduce the effects of these issues on people's health and lively well-being. And so this theory then also supports investments in renewable energy and green technologies, and it highlights the importance of sustainable development and market-based solutions for ecological issues, all right? And then lastly, I think just like some key takeaways from this. So here, there's a couple of things I want everybody to take away from this workshop before we maybe go into some questions. When we talked about investment and we talked about financialization, right? I think the key takeaway there is that value is increasingly becoming fake. I'm using the word fake. You can use whatever word you want, right? But the situation here is that prices and our understanding of value is artificially inflated through formal practices that institutions are allowed to carry out within society through things like investments into hedge funds, stocks, etc., means that we are constantly pushing money around without immediately getting goods and services in exchange for it. Okay. And therefore, the question of value can play out maybe in the long term or maybe doesn't, but that value does not exist in the same way that we assumed it to be for us to understand the economy in the first place. Okay. And so you might say there's a couple of ways you can approach this kind of argumentation. A lot of people argue that um, going back to the theory of equilibrium, if you track patterns of people who have invested in the stock market over the last 50 years, they have lost money at certain points, but if they consistently invested in the stock market, they eventually would still make a profit of all the money that they invested over time. And so that shows that like continuous investment, perhaps there's an argument to say is always going to yield positive results. But again, what Dr. Vines in the beginning that I quoted, right? His key issue is to say that that was under an economy that didn't experience the same amount of shocks that this economy does. And so if we start tracking today, the next 50 years of investment in the stock market, will it yield the same results? Is still something that is going to be questioned, all right? And so how do we protect people from bad investments, from increasingly scamming investments, from misunderstood investments like into digital currencies? How do we increasingly make sure people understand the value that they're getting, that it's not artificially inflated, even in basic things like our understanding of the goods that we're buying? The big conversation that I, as a girly pup on the internet, am involved in is fashion and the creation of garments nowadays, right? We're constantly talking about how the quality of our garments today are not the same as they were before, and corners are increasingly being cut, and we're starting to understand that that means that we then need to spend more money over time to have garments that look nice in order to wear and be presentable out into society, okay? So even though the price has stayed the same, the value inherently has diminished. That is artificial inflation of that value, right? Moreover, like someone is then profiting from those corners being cut increasingly. And if I didn't understand that, I would just continue to buy into a system. But then if I do understand where that value actually comes from in garments, the stitching, the type of fabric that's being used, etc., I can then look for alternatives that meet that criteria for me, and thus I can maintain the value that I get from my purchasing power. That takes away a lot of time from me and needs a lot of consumer education to be expected of me to maintain value. I don't then trust the institutions like clothing regulations in the same way we have food regulations, you know. I don't have to know what every single word on your products in the supermarket mean, all of those fancy biological food science words, because I trust that the institutions that are in charge of food quality allowed this on my supermarket stalls because it's safe for me to eat. But if I increasingly don't get value from that, I don't trust those institutions, okay? And then the onus is on me as an individual to educate myself to increasingly find value within my consumer purchases. So a question then becomes like, is it should be up to me, or should it be up to regulations through institutions to make sure that value is in line with purchasing power and that it is not being manipulated or taken away or cut through corners in a way that someone can increasingly profit off of my purchasing power without me getting the same amount of value as I did 10 years ago? Secondly, I think a key takeaway, right, is that ownership is an increasingly common determining factor in our modern economics and what makes it uniquely good, all right? So I would say that like most forward-thinking policies are ones that are considering how to redistribute wealth back to people. And I don't want this to fall into simplistic paradigms of like, oh, should you be a communist country or a capitalist country? I once did an entire session about just like communal economics, communist economics, and Karl Marx theory at a university. And one of the questions that people from the audience gave me is that, like, but do you really think that like socialism or communism will win? And the way I responded to that as a debater, obviously, was to say something as simple as it's not a boxing match. We need to interrogate all of the economic theories and policies that are in front of us, and that includes additional anti-hegemonic schools of thought that we have, right? And then what we need to do through that interrogation is decide what is working and what is not working. We keep what is working, we need to challenge, change, and reform what is not working. Right now, maybe you would say that like we still need money. Like we need money as a distribution system. You know, it's administratively a lot easier than carrying my cows to exchange them for wheat in a barter system. Okay, like I need the cash. I need a credit card or a card for my money. That makes sense, sure. But do I need money to be distributed through financial institutions and put into financial products? Probably, maybe also yes, maybe no. That's where we can start debating more. And so that's where we start to ask the questions that are necessary for what redistributing wealth and being able to access better economic policies actually looks like, right? Then, thirdly, often a huge thing in debating is just a um often a huge thing is just forgetting the role of financial institutions, right? So that's what I've talked about quite a lot here, is just that like the way we talk about economics in debating forgets that there is also investment as part of that economic model and how that should look in the way that we are structuring our results and our solutions in debates. Hopefully, I've at least inspired you all to think about that a little bit more. But then that still is a question. This is actually a sub point, not a full point, about a power play between our governments and their institutions and the regulation that we have over our financial products and our financial markets. Financial markets are becoming more and more prevalent within society. And so we need to better understand them so that we can work with them and not against them. But we also need to be able to regulate them so that they don't exist only for their benefit and not for my benefit. I think I probably will always buy financial products. I do right now, even as a mid-20s individual, right? But I can do that because I understand what I'm doing with my money, so I feel confident enough to do that. And then lastly, there's no one singular way to think about the economy. There are alternative schools of thought. There are so many we didn't even get into during this session today. Austrian economics, feminist economics, lots of other schools of thought that you can go and explore that can then show you alternative ways to approach these big economic questions. All right. And the way I would say use that in debating, I would say just go do it for your personal growth as an individual. But like, if I had to say how to use that in debating, I wouldn't say go up and just shout like, but you're not considering Austrian economics because your governments probably aren't, right? But actually lay out the logic of what it is challenging about capitalism or just our classical economic systems and theories, and then what its different approach is. That's what your judges are going to buy into. That's what your judges are going to talk about. All right. Finally, the host of Free Economics Radio is Stephen Dubner, and he ends every episode by saying, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. And I think that encapsulates what we should all be taking from modern economic thought and modern economic theory is that we should all be increasingly focused on taking care of one another. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm now going to have a look if anybody has any questions. Please put them in the chats. It's just easier for me to get round to, and then we can have a little bit more of a discussion. But probably have to leave in about 15 minutes. And I also don't want to make this live stream so long that it's going to break YouTube when our wonderful hosts upload it. Okay. So Darren had a question about what is the relationship between a free market, a fair market, and are they mutually exclusive? So that is a good question. When we think about a free market, it is defined, or what's unique about it is being able to have as little government interference in our economic exchanges as much as possible. We don't have trade barriers like tariffs. We don't have regulations on what we're allowed to buy or what we're allowed to sell within our national markets or what we're allowed to buy and sell and move over borders from international markets, and how we're able to use our money and to what extent. For example, it also might affect things like funeral purchases, pensions, being able to purchase financial products. All of these are government regulations that are questioned in a free market. To some extent, you do need to have your own power over your purchasing power. Like you do need to have a free market to some extent, right? Because you as an individual know yourself the best and can make the best or at least the most specific economic decisions for you, right? I, as a government, generally maybe know what society needs, but I don't know what you specifically as an individual needs. Maybe it's really, really important to you and your livelihood and your happiness to spend most of your money on Labubus. And then you should be allowed to do that. You should be allowed to make whatever financial decisions that you want. So people generally do support a free market. I don't think that having regulation has to take away from people's ability to have freedom within a market, right? However, what regulation should do in a fair market is it should stop free market principles from allowing then overpowering institutions to be able to exploit that there is no regulation or intermediate authority to stop me from making bad purchases, right? So in a completely conceptualized absolute free market, then anyone can sell me anything. They can give whatever reasoning. They're not regulated into how they advertise. Even if they are regulated into how they advertise, not everything is good for every individual. And so this can affect, again, like the financial products that I buy, but also the actual products that I buy, but also just like what am I allowed to have access to, right? And so government regulation over these things is perhaps not to limit your freedom, but to protect you. And if you think protectionism and freedom are mutually exclusive, that's where you're perhaps seeing a problem, right? So we generally want a free market until a free market starts to harm us. Then we want some level of government intervention. And so when you're questioning, and there's many clashes in a debate, in a lot of debates, in your basic political debates, where it's about like this house would ban cigarettes, for example, is a question about individual choices versus government regulations for the betterment of people's health. And then similarly in social policy debates, similarly in economics debates, a lot of it is a clash between the government and the individual. And so again, just general principle basis of choice, which you can also go and learn more about in Ashish Kumar's Super Shiny Principles on YouTube. He talks about choice for a little bit there as well. The general theory is that we want to have choices, but we obviously don't want to have choices that harm us, right? I don't want to be allowed to stab myself, for example, in a free society. It's the same with like economic choices, right? I don't want to spend money on scams. So I do want government regulation of scams. I don't want to like spend my money on things that are not going to be best for me. So I want a process of business registration so that I can distinguish and say, do you have a brick and mortar? Do you have a website? Do you have a registration code? If you don't have those things and you're selling me something in a WhatsApp group chat, it's probably because you weren't able to get those things because you're not practicing business practices that means that this would be a product or a service that would be beneficial to me. Do you have some kind of license to do lip injections, for example, is a big thing that's happening right now in America on the internet, right? Uh, if not, then I don't trust you. And so that is a form of government regulation through the creation of institutions that allows a more fair market, if not a more free market, and that's okay. All right, so I think that that kind of answers the question. Darren, you can tell me if it answers the question. If you have, oh, this is Bandile. This is not Darren. Hi, Bandile. If you have any more questions, let me know. Anybody else got any questions? I'm really enjoying the session. uh when Shiva asked me like to do a session, I was like, I'd really just want to talk about sovereign wealth funds for an hour. And I feel like I got to do that, and that makes me happy. Yes, absolutely. It will be sent. And also the entire live stream is also going to be uploaded. Thank you for asking. Someone asked if the presentation will be sent. All right, guys, if there's no more questions, you guys
So
can
I
find me
have
at
a question. I
oh,
have a question regarding the organizational structure of economic decisions. When it
yeah.
comes, means where it's more applicable in which places, because in places where there are multiple conflicts of ideologies, probably say a developing nation, underdeveloped nations where you have probably divisions in terms of say ideologies or whatever, then the process of conclusion becomes way longer because you're just trying to bring in everyone's input. In those cases where you have many people with probably who are actually illiterate but probably are the ones who are traditional or who actually belong to that place, then bringing them or at least having a goal of actual economic prosperity, how to then handle that in organizational structure.
All right, that's a really good question, actually. I've also just written it down. I think there's a couple of things there. Two main things I want to bring in from the presentation that we've also talked about, right? Is that this is also perhaps a complication of cooperative economies and cooperative economics, right? So if you have lots of people who have the same level of membership, same stake and ownership in these institutions and the way that they're carried out, how do you make sure that you're representing everyone? Are people happy if they're in the minority to just give in to that the majority rules? And if the majority rules is not in the favor actually of what's best for people because people are co-opted by simplistic messaging or just anti whatever ideological sentiments, and that means that their investments or that their institutional structures fail, is that okay because of the basis of representation? I'm going to say that like that is a complication of cooperative economics, but that is a big philosophical question about governance in general that I would say does not, like, I cannot answer completely in this session. However, when it comes to economic institutions that follow basic principles and already have some level of government education, like, for example, there's a huge debate about like the rise of private banking systems in places like Thailand, in Bangkok specifically, being collectivized, right? Also in South Africa, we have lots of like private banks alongside government owned banks, alongside obviously our central banks and distribution systems, okay? And so with those kind of economic institutions that are then competing with one another, you can say then that they do have to meet some kind of middle ground because expansion of the free market of those financial products can to some extent mitigate like some big harms at very least, because then that would stand in stark contrast to any of the institutions that are competing with you. So should we over centralize our institutions in the name of efficiency? Absolutely not, right? In the same way, you wouldn't do that within in any economic industry. We know that that creates the fury of monopolizing, and that is harmful to economies. It's the same with institutions. But then, secondly, right, we need increasingly like useful accountability structures. Okay. So there's a lot of accountability structures that you can create. Obviously, there's regulation through law, government regulation that is more direct through policy, right? That can affect these institutions or hold them accountable in a retrospective sense. Us as people who have to buy into these institutions can also be educated, and that is an accountability structure. You would have to prove in a debate, perhaps a little bit difficult, but the pivot point is that there is so much outrage and so much education that there would be a mass pullout and pivoting point. But that is possible, and that has happened to institutions before. If we all just stop following, for example, a very basic law that we just don't see as useful, then and the law isn't being upheld by any other accountability structure, then it might exist, but it doesn't actually have an effect on our lives. And so when people are perhaps being like taken away through bureaucratic processes or through ideological disputes that are creating outcomes that harm individuals, I would say that the very easy way to then like look at it from an economics perspective is to look at those outcomes to say what behavior led to this outcome, and then or behavior or decisions, right, is what I'm more saying. And then from that, you can then critique which decision should fall and which decision should stay, regardless of the ideological perspective, right? That works better in some economic spaces than others. Like, for example, in the financial market, there is a very basic need for financial products, which is to increase value. And so if you're increasing that value, right, you don't have to be as considerate as what maybe the government is accountable for. And the government will, unless, like, for example, hedge funds are funding wars overseas, that could also still be accountability measures. But the government exists and governance should exist. Democracy institutions should exist parallel to economic institutions as a form of accountability, so that you can make sure that the actors who have to care about what people care about, and thus the moral considerations of society, and not purely utilitarianistic like bases of society, then are able to carry out accountability on economic institutions. And again, we all have like those institutions, governance, democracy, as a concept that is held through governance, and then economic institutions through things like banks, through things like private equity firms, through things like businesses that are private or publicly owned, all have to exist in the same space. And therefore, they do, to some extent, have to be accountable to one another, whether they want to or not, and also regardless of how much power they have or not, because they are interconnected. Okay. And so if your country is failing to be able to create successful accountability structures, and my country is, right, South Africa really is, um, for your economic institutions, then you don't just have to question what policies that you have. You might have great policies. We have fantastic policies to a large extent, but you have to consider the accountability structures. Journalism is absolutely failing. There's no investments in journalism, right? And so because then people aren't understanding the problems that there are, then people can't use the channels that they have in democracy in order to voice the concerns that journalism would highlight to maintain accountability. Secondly, people are removed from their democratic structure. So if I heard something from the news that I want to voice my opinion about, maybe I can post a tweet on X and social media, or I can go to a town hall meeting. But I find that a lot of people don't know when their town hall meetings are, or if they're even taking place. And so we're removed from our democratic structures, and protest action is perhaps not working because it's being clamped down on, because it's being painted badly in the media. All of that is a failure of democracy to then hold these institutions accountable. And then but then that is when you can like identify major harms, right? Um, and I'm assuming that that's the problem that you're identifying then also with like in different ideologies existing in the same place. But if it just basically is that there just are two different ideologies, and perhaps people are upset because they're like, ooh, this policy sounds a little communisty, and I just don't like that. And so people get upset. And we do see sentiments like that in the world, like that is how people just react to things. That doesn't mean that you can represent that is the way sentiments play out in your debates, but you can also say that it doesn't need to be that way, because successful economic policies exist on spectrums, and successful economic practices exist on spectrums, right? I do think we need to make movements towards more distribution. We do need to make movements towards more common goods, right? But you're still going to have to manage the current capitalist economy. You're still going to have to allow for private equity to exist to some extent. There is place for it, whilst also reducing unemployment, whilst also reducing wealth disparity amongst people. And that can be achieved, right? For example, no, I can't. I'll think of an example later, right? So yeah, so I think that then, like the main thing then you would want to do in a debate to prove that your economic institutions can work, and actually even outside of a debate, right, is to focus then on tracking the decisions, tracking the like what happens when you make those decisions, the impacts of those decisions, and then asking yourself if that is what is in line with the economy in terms of growth, and that can be GDP, but that is a flawed mechanism of measuring. So you can use other mechanisms of measuring the economy. And then secondly, in terms of general like principles, not huge economic differences, but just general principles, maybe things like upholding human rights and democracy can be your basic framework that you use, Does that answer your question? I gave a lot there. I gave three responses to it.
Yep, I got the answer. Basically means in order to then execute or do this, it would require a good amount of framing that's required to at least get to this organizational structure. I mean, direct,
Absolutely.
straightforward, this thing won't be working because this would probably create more issues than it would be solving.
Absolutely, guys. I think like I studied economics now for, okay, let me not age myself. I'm a novice. No, I'm kidding. But like I have studied economics a lot more than people that I'm probably speaking against in debates. And I don't then come up and say, I have three economics degrees, and then I just throw a bunch of jargon at them to show that I understand that like I have three economics degrees, and then just be like, that's anti-Keyinist, and what about this, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I will literally like talk about it as if I'm like explaining a movie scene in a script, word by word, like work through the actual interactions that are happening and the impacts that happen from then. Still in an efficient manner. There's obviously a balance to it in speeches, but I don't overcomplicate it with economic jargon because, like, I also can't, assume that my judges understand that. So you still have to take it back to like, what are the incentives, who are the actors, and what are the impacts of the decisions? So that's what we said at the beginning. Economics and the economy is all just an interconnected web of decisions. I think that's a great way to wrap this up, guys. I do kind of have to move to a next meeting that's happening at 45 past. I kind of just want to get some water in between that. If anybody has any additional questions, you can just message me on WhatsApp at any time. Please be transported through the channels to find me. I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for having me. I'll hand back over to the organizers to either like stop the Zoom or any other takeaways or closing up statements you guys want to give. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let me know in the chat what you like the most about the workshop. I always like asking people that.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for actually taking this wonderful workshop for us. We're really pleased to have you on board alongside us for East India Pre-WUDC. This is really an amazing opportunity for both internal SOC members and for participants from across the globe to engage with quality discussions with regards to different debate topics. But most importantly, this was a stellar workshop, and we sincerely want to thank you so much for providing us with your time. I hope everyone here you enjoyed the workshop. Just here, closing remarks from the organizing committee. We have much more planned for the pre-Worlds tournament that we are hosting. Stay tuned because there are a lot of other updates coming up as well. And most important, thank you so much, Shannon.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. I enjoyed it so much.